The story of the Weimar Republic begins not in hope, but in fire, defeat, and revolution. It is born from the ashes of Imperial Germany, a country left reeling in the final months of World War I. In 1918, the German Empire was collapsing. Exhausted by years of war, starved by a blockade, and facing military defeat on all fronts, the German people were nearing revolt. The Kaiser, Wilhelm Roman II, had ruled as an autocrat, and under his watch, Germany had launched itself into a war that it could not win. By late 1918, the Allies were advancing, the German army was crumbling, and unrest was growing in the cities and naval ports. The spark came in Kiel, where mutinous sailors refused orders, igniting a revolution that spread rapidly across the nation. Within days, workers' and soldiers' councils were springing up, modeled after the Russian Soviets. The monarchy could not survive this wave of rebellion. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. In Berlin, amidst chaos, two declarations of a republic were proclaimed. One came from Philipp Scheidemann of the Social Democratic Party SPD, who stood on a balcony of the Reichstag and declared the German Republic. Only 2 hours later, Karl Liebknecht of the more radical Spartacist faction proclaimed a free socialist republic. It was unclear who spoke for the revolution, and more importantly, what kind of state would now emerge. The Weimar Republic, named not for Berlin, but for the city of Weimar, where the new constitution was drafted, faced an impossible inheritance. It had to negotiate a peace treaty with the victorious Allied powers. It had to pacify the radical left, which called for a Bolshevik-style uprising, and also the conservative forces, the old elites, the military, and the nationalists, who resented the Republic and saw its leaders as traitors. From the outset, the Republic was fragile. The first government, led by Friedrich Ebert of the SPD, tried to maintain control by aligning with the old military leadership. In January 1919, the Spartacist uprising broke out in Berlin, led by Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. The new government responded with brutal force, using the Freikorps, paramilitary units made up largely of ex-soldiers, to crush the rebellion. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were arrested and murdered. This act, of a nominally democratic government crushing the far left with far-right militias, set a pattern that would haunt the Weimar years. The Weimar Constitution, passed in 1919, was in many ways advanced for its time. It included universal suffrage, proportional representation, and a strong presidency. But its design also contained fatal flaws. Article 48 gave the president the power to rule by decree in an emergency, bypassing parliament. This clause would later become the legal lever for dictatorship. Meanwhile, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, dealt a staggering blow to the new republic's legitimacy. The treaty imposed territorial losses, disarmament, and massive reparations payments. Most Germans saw it as a national humiliation. Worse, the treaty blamed Germany alone for the war in the so-called war guilt clause. The men who signed the treaty, all civilian politicians of the Weimar government, were branded the November criminals by nationalists. A myth took hold that Germany had not been defeated in the field, but had been stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and traitors at home. This Dolchstoß legend, or stab-in-the-back legend, would poison German politics for years to come. The army, having avoided a full surrender, fed the myth. Its leaders claimed they could have fought on, if not for the betrayal of the home front. In reality, the army had urged the Kaiser to seek peace, knowing the war was lost. But the myth served many interests, including the right-wing press, the old aristocracy, and soon the radical right. The early years of the Republic were marked by violence, inflation, and attempted coups. In 1920, the Kapp Putsch saw right-wing Freikorps march into Berlin and attempt to overthrow the government. Civil servants and army officers refused to oppose them. It was only a general strike by the working class that forced the Putschists to retreat. But the lesson was clear. The Republic's enemies were within its own institutions. On the left, there were further uprisings in the Ruhr and Saxony. The government, again, used the army and Freikorps to put them down. Political assassinations became common. In 1921, Matthias Erzberger, a Catholic Centre Party politician who had signed the armistice, was murdered. In 1922, Walther Rathenau, the Jewish foreign minister and a key figure in Weimar diplomacy, was assassinated by right-wing extremists. Over 350 political murders were committed in the early years. The judiciary, dominated by conservative judges, was lenient with right-wing killers and harsh with leftists. Meanwhile, the economy spiraled into crisis. Reparations payments strained the budget, and when Germany fell behind, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923. German workers went on strike in protest, and the government printed money to support them. This led to one of the worst episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. The German mark became worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows, and savings were wiped out overnight. Middle-class Germans, who had supported the Republic, now felt betrayed and impoverished. That same year, 1923, saw another failed coup, the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich, led by an obscure Austrian agitator named Adolf Hitler. His Nazi party, along with General Ludendorff and other right-wing groups, tried to seize power. The putsch failed, and Hitler was arrested. But the trial gave him a national platform. He used it to denounce the Republic, the Jews, the Marxists, and the Versailles Treaty. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months, during which he dictated Mein Kampf. The Nazi Party would go underground, but not disappear. By late 1923, the Republic teetered on the brink of collapse, but in an extraordinary turn, it survived. Under Chancellor Gustav Stresemann, a currency reform stabilized the economy. The Rentenmark replaced the hyperinflated mark. Foreign loans, especially from the United States under the Dawes Plan, helped restart industry. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations. The mid to late 1920s are sometimes called the golden years of the Weimar Republic. Berlin became a center of culture, science, and the arts. Cabaret, modernist architecture, and avant-garde cinema flourished. Intellectuals like Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, and Bertolt Brecht shaped a vibrant public life. For a moment, it seemed that the Republic might endure, but beneath the surface, its foundations were still brittle. The political system remained fragmented. Dozens of parties vied for votes under proportional representation. No single party could command a majority, leading to unstable coalition governments. The extreme left and right never accepted the Republic's legitimacy. The army remained a state within a state. The judiciary, civil service, and universities were dominated by old imperial elites who saw democracy as a temporary disorder. Moreover, the economic recovery was built on foreign loans and short-term optimism. When the global economy faltered, so too would the Weimar Republic. That moment came with the Wall Street crash of 1929. The American stock market collapse triggered a worldwide depression. U.S. loans to Germany dried up. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were out of work. The misery and desperation radicalized the electorate. The Nazi Party, which had been marginal, surged in support. In 1928, they had won only 2.6% of the vote. By 1930, they leapt to 18%. In July 1932, they became the largest party in the Reichstag, with 37% of the vote. Hitler's message of national revival, scapegoating of Jews and communists, and rejection of the Versailles Treaty found a willing audience. The middle class, battered by depression, turned to authoritarian promises. The youth, disillusioned, were drawn to militant ideology. The communists also gained support. German politics became a battlefield. Street violence between Nazi brownshirts and communist Red Front fighters became routine. The Reichstag was paralyzed. democracy seemed unable to govern. Chancellor after chancellor failed to command a majority. President Paul von Hindenburg, aging and reactionary, increasingly ruled by decree using Article 48. The last chancellor to try governing democratically was Heinrich Brüning. His austerity policies deepened the depression. His successors, Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, sought to manipulate Hitler and use him as a puppet, but they underestimated him. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Conservative elites believed they could control him. Within months, democracy would be extinguished. The appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, is often seen as the death knell of the Weimar Republic. But in truth, the Republic had already been fatally wounded long before. What followed was not an abrupt coup, but a rapid and legal dismantling of democracy from within. Hitler did not seize power. It was handed to him by a clique of conservative elites, men like Franz von Papen and President Hindenburg, who believed they could harness the Nazi movement for their own ends. They saw Hitler as a tool, a populist figurehead who could rally the masses while they controlled the reins of government. They were catastrophically wrong. The first months of 1933 revealed the full vulnerability of the Weimar system. Hitler wasted no time consolidating power. Just 4 weeks after his appointment, on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building was set ablaze. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene and quickly blamed for the fire. Whether he acted alone or whether the fire was orchestrated by the Nazis themselves remains debated, but its impact was immediate and devastating. Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, seized on the moment, portraying the fire as the first act of a massive communist insurrection. The next day, the Reichstag fire decree was issued by President Hindenburg under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. It suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and privacy. It authorized the arrest of political opponents without cause and allowed for the censorship of media and mail. Thousands of communists, socialists, trade unionists, and left-leaning intellectuals were arrested. Communist leaders were imprisoned or fled abroad. The German Communist Party KPD was effectively outlawed. The groundwork for one-party rule had been laid through entirely legal means. Despite this repression, Germany still went to the polls on March 5, 1933. The Nazis hoped for an outright majority, but fell short, receiving 43.9% of the vote. Combined with the seats held by their nationalist allies, they controlled a slim majority, but not the two-thirds majority needed to change the constitution. Hitler now set his sights on the Enabling Act. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag met under the intimidating presence of SA and SS troops. Many communist deputies were under arrest. Others did not dare attend. The Centre Party, under pressure and in fear, voted in favor of the act, believing Hitler's promises to respect Catholic interests. The Enabling Act passed with 444 votes to 94. Only the Social Democrats opposed it openly. Otto Wels, their leader, gave a defiant speech in defense of democracy, one of the last free speeches made in the Reichstag. The Enabling Act gave Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary consent, effectively rendering the Reichstag obsolete. With this legal authority, Hitler and the Nazi Party began to dismantle the Weimar Republic piece by piece. All trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front. Opposition parties were banned. The Social Democratic Party was outlawed in June 1933, and by July, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal party in Germany. Federal states lost autonomy, their parliaments replaced by Nazi governors. The judiciary was brought into line through purges and pressure. Civil service laws excluded Jews and political dissidents from government jobs. By the summer of 1933, Germany was no longer a republic in any meaningful sense. The democratic framework still existed on paper, but all real power was in the hands of the Nazi regime. The institutions that had once been designed to safeguard democracy, emergency decrees, presidential authority, proportional representation, had instead been used to destroy it. The very architecture of the Weimar Constitution enabled its own demise. How had it come to this? The fall of the Weimar Republic was not a single event, but a process. It was the cumulative effect of economic collapse, political fragmentation, social trauma, and institutional weakness. Each of these elements undermined faith in democracy and created space for authoritarian alternatives. Economically, the Republic had suffered two devastating blows: hyperinflation in 1923 and the Great Depression after 1929. The first destroyed savings, and the second destroyed livelihoods. Millions of Germans associated the democratic system with instability, unemployment, and chaos. While the golden years of 1924 to 1929 offered some relief, they were short-lived and heavily dependent on foreign capital. The withdrawal of US loans after 1929 exposed the fragility of the German recovery. The government's austerity response to the Depression only deepened the crisis, alienating workers and the middle class alike. Politically, the Weimar Republic never achieved consensus. The electorate was polarized. On one side were parties that believed in the Republic, the Social Democrats, the Centre Party, and Liberals, but they were constantly at odds with each other. On the other side were parties that wanted to destroy it, the Communists who sought revolution and the National Socialists who sought dictatorship. As the crises mounted, support for the extremes grew. The center could not hold. Culturally, the Republic also struggled with its identity. To some, it was a beacon of modernism, liberalism, and progress. To others, it represented decadence, weakness, and national shame. The Versailles Treaty haunted the Republic from birth. It was blamed not only for economic suffering, but also for the loss of national pride. The myth that Germany had been betrayed in 1918 rather than defeated shaped public consciousness. The Republic was seen by many as a foreign imposition, not an expression of German will. Institutionally, the Weimar Constitution had serious flaws. Proportional representation allowed for many small parties and unstable coalitions. The president held too much power and was not clearly accountable. Article 48, meant as an emergency provision, became a tool of authoritarian rule. The Republic lacked robust democratic traditions. The army, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and the universities were not reformed after the monarchy's fall. They remained loyal to conservative and often anti-democratic ideals. All of this created a perfect storm. When crisis returned in the early 1930s, the Republic had few defenders left. The conservative elites who distrusted democracy believed they could manage the Nazis. The working class was divided between social democrats and communists. The middle class, radicalized by fear and economic ruin, turned to the promises of order and national renewal offered by Hitler. And yet, the Weimar Republic was not fated to fail. At several points, different choices might have changed the course of history. Stronger alliances among pro-democratic forces, a more inclusive and less punitive peace treaty, deeper reforms of state institutions. Any of these might have given the Republic a better chance. But history is not made in hindsight. It is made in the storms of its time, and in the case of Weimar, those storms were overwhelming. The story of the Weimar Republic is more than just a cautionary tale. It is a vivid illustration of how democracy can be hollowed out from within, how legal structures can be used to destroy liberty, how economic despair can empower extremism, how propaganda, violence, and fear can override reason, and how a society, exhausted by crisis and division, can surrender its freedom not with a sudden revolution, but with a series of small steps, each justified by the need for stability. When Hitler rose to power, he did so not as an outsider smashing the gates, but as a chancellor invited in by the very institutions meant to protect democracy. He built his dictatorship not in defiance of the law, but by manipulating it. The Weimar Republic did not fall in a blaze. It rotted and was replaced. But even at its end, the Republic left behind traces of hope. The intellectual and artistic legacy of Weimar continues to shape modern culture. Its attempt to build a democratic state in the wake of war and empire, though ultimately unsuccessful, provided important lessons for future generations. After the fall of the Third Reich, those lessons were remembered when West Germany crafted a new constitution, the Basic Law, with stronger protections against authoritarianism. The Weimar Republic lived only 14 years, from 1919 to 1933. But in that short time, it experienced nearly every challenge a democracy can face: revolution, counter-revolution, economic collapse, extremism, polarization, and war guilt. Its history remains one of the most important case studies of democratic fragility in the modern world. The collapse of Weimar reminds us that democracy is not a fixed achievement. It is a constant effort, a balance between freedom and order, compromise and conviction, rights and responsibilities. When that balance is lost, when the foundations are neglected, collapse becomes possible. And once lost, democracy is not easily restored. As the Nazi regime took root and democracy in Germany died, the final legacy of the Weimar Republic became one of both warning and paradox. In many ways, the Republic had embodied some of the most progressive and modern ideals of its time. Yet those very ideals were consumed by the very forces they failed to contain. To understand this paradox fully, one must examine the society that gave birth to Weimar and how it struggled with the conflicting tides of modernity, nationalism, memory, and trauma. Germany after 1918 was a deeply fractured society. The war had not only devastated the economy, but had also disoriented the collective psyche of the nation. For 4 years, Germans had been told by imperial propaganda that victory was near, that their sacrifices were noble, that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. Then came the armistice, a stunning, disorienting collapse. The return of soldiers to a defeated homeland created a sense of betrayal. Veterans came back to a country they no longer recognized, governed by civilians, reviled by the international community, and racked with unrest. Many of these men would join the Freikorps, forming the nucleus of the militant right that would haunt Weimar politics. They brought with them a culture of violence, a belief in action over deliberation, and an intense hatred for the new order. At the same time, German cities were undergoing profound social transformations. Urbanization accelerated. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Artistic expression flourished, embracing modernism, abstraction, sexuality, and satire. For some Germans, particularly in Berlin, this was a time of liberation and creativity. For others, especially in the conservative countryside and among the religious faithful, it seemed like moral decay. The Weimar period was thus a battleground not only of politics, but of culture, between tradition and modernity, faith and secularism, militarism and pacifism. This cultural clash was magnified by the sharp polarization in media and public discourse. The press in Weimar Germany was highly partisan, with newspapers affiliated with every political party, each offering vastly different interpretations of reality. Conspiracy theories spread through right-wing outlets, particularly the idea that the Republic's founders had sold out Germany to the Allies. Anti-Semitic myths flourished, many targeting prominent Jewish politicians, intellectuals, or bankers. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fake document purporting to reveal a Jewish plan for world domination, was translated into German and widely distributed. Meanwhile, political parties operated in a fragmented and often confrontational system. There were multiple parties across the spectrum: the SPD Social Democrats, the Zentrum Catholic Center, the DDP Liberal Democrats, the DNVP nationalist conservatives, the KPD communists, and eventually the NSDAP Nazis. Coalition building was difficult and often short-lived. Cabinets rose and fell rapidly. Voters shifted allegiance frequently, frustrated with the inability of any one party to deliver lasting stability. This lack of trust in political leadership eroded the legitimacy of the system itself. During the so-called Golden Twenties, between 1924 and 1929, there was a genuine opportunity for democratic consolidation. Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann played a key role in stabilizing relations with Western powers, renegotiating reparations through the Dawes Plan and later the Young Plan. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926, signaling a reintegration into the international community. Cultural exports like German cinema, Bauhaus architecture, and modern philosophy brought Weimar acclaim abroad. Unemployment fell, inflation was controlled, and German cities flourished with nightlife and experimentation. Yet the underlying tensions never disappeared. Stresemann himself warned that Germany was dancing on a volcano. Much of the economic recovery depended on American credit, and the prosperity never reached all classes. The working poor remained vulnerable, rural farmers struggled with debt and falling prices, and resentment lingered in the former aristocracy and military leadership, who had lost their social primacy. These grievances formed a reservoir of discontent that extremist parties would later tap into. The crash of 1929 unleashed this discontent. The Great Depression had global effects, but Germany was particularly exposed. Unemployment skyrocketed, banks collapsed, families lost everything. The welfare system, already fragile, was overwhelmed. Desperation returned with a vengeance, and with it came the revival of political extremism. Street battles between Nazi stormtroopers and communist paramilitaries became common. The Republic descended into a state of low-level civil conflict. By 1932, democracy existed mostly in name. President Hindenburg, who had once reluctantly supported the Republic, was now a symbol of reactionary conservatism. He ruled increasingly through presidential decrees, bypassing the Reichstag. The Nazis, after winning the largest share of the vote in July 1932, demanded power, but were initially rebuffed. Chancellor Franz von Papen attempted to govern without a parliamentary majority, relying on Hindenburg's authority and military support. His failure led to a political crisis that opened the door for a Nazi deal. Papen and others in the conservative elite believed they could tame Hitler by bringing him into a coalition government. They thought his popularity could be used to stabilize the country, while the real power would remain with traditional institutions. This arrogance, this fatal underestimation of the Nazi movement, proved catastrophic. Once inside the government, Hitler and his followers moved with speed and precision. They exploited every legal mechanism, silenced every opposition voice, and turned every institution into an instrument of totalitarian rule. The final months of the Weimar Republic were marked by symbolic moments of defeat. The Reichstag, once the symbol of democratic debate, became a rubber stamp. Political parties dissolved or were banned. The SPD was driven underground. The communists had already been crushed. Civil liberties disappeared. Independent trade unions were eliminated. The press became a propaganda organ. The SA and SS enforced loyalty through fear and violence. Teachers, judges, and civil servants were purged and replaced with loyal Nazis. By the summer of 1933, Hitler was not merely Chancellor, he was Führer in all but name. And in August 1934, upon Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President. A nationwide plebiscite confirmed him as Führer und Reichskanzler. The Republic was dead. Its final breath came not with a revolution, but with legal decrees, manipulated elections, and a chain of accommodations by those who thought they could manage the flames they had ignited. What made the collapse of the Weimar Republic particularly tragic was not just that it failed, but that it had tried to succeed under the most impossible circumstances. Its architects were not villains, but reformers. Its constitution was not flawed in intent, but in execution. Its people were not inherently undemocratic, but caught between war, humiliation, and crisis. Weimar was a noble experiment, made in the shadow of catastrophe and destroyed by the belief, common in every generation, that order is more important than liberty, that fear justifies obedience, and that democracy is expendable in times of trouble. And yet, its legacy endured. The lessons of Weimar were not entirely lost. After the Second World War, West Germany deliberately designed a new political system that corrected many of Weimar's mistakes. The Basic Law of 1949 created a stronger executive, more stable parliamentary coalitions, and protections against both left-wing and right-wing extremism. Article 48 was gone. So was the president's power to rule by decree. Parties that sought to undermine democracy could be banned. Education emphasized civic responsibility. The media was rebuilt under principles of pluralism and accountability. In many ways, the post-war German Republic became everything Weimar had aspired to be. But that success came only after the country passed through dictatorship, genocide, and war. It came at a staggering human cost. The collapse of the Weimar Republic did not merely result in authoritarian rule. It led to the rise of a regime that would unleash the most destructive war in human history, murder millions in the Holocaust, and plunge Europe into devastation. The fall of Weimar was not just a German tragedy, it was a global one. To understand fully how the Weimar Republic collapsed, it is vital to look not just at the political structures or the catastrophic decisions, but at the people who lived through it. Weimar Germany was not merely the battleground of ideologies. It was the lived experience of tens of millions of citizens, workers, veterans, intellectuals, students, mothers, soldiers, each watching their world fracture in real time, often powerless to stop it. Consider the disillusioned soldier returning from the front in 1918. He had endured the horror of trench warfare, watched friends die in mud and gas, and believed the war had been a test of German strength. Now he found his empire gone, the Kaiser exiled, and civilians, many of them socialists or Jews, he was told, had surrendered the nation. He was told Germany had been stabbed in the back. This lie, propagated by the military elite and embraced by nationalist circles, would become gospel to an entire generation. Many of these men found community and purpose in the paramilitary Freikorps, whose violence was tacitly supported by the early Weimar governments. These men did not see democracy as their savior, they saw it as their betrayal. Now picture a middle-class family in 1923. Inflation is not a headline, they live it. Prices double in days. Savings vanish overnight. A pension that once guaranteed security now buys nothing. Some people use currency to wallpaper their homes because it's cheaper than buying paper. Hunger stalks the cities. Desperation spreads. Extremists gain sympathy. Communists promise the power of the workers. Nazis promise restoration of national pride and vengeance. Neither promise democracy. Weimar's democracy, for all its legal trappings, never inspired universal loyalty. To many conservatives, it was a humiliation, a product of defeat. To many on the far left, it was a compromise with capitalists. Between them, the middle struggled to hold. Within the government itself, many politicians understood the stakes, but were trapped by the very mechanisms of the system. Proportional representation ensured that every party, no matter how small, gained a voice, but also guaranteed fractured coalitions and unstable cabinets. No single party could govern alone, and compromises became routine. This led to public cynicism. Governments changed frequently, and no one seemed in charge for long. Crisis governance became the norm. When Stresemann died in 1929, the Republic lost one of its few true statesmen. His efforts to stabilize the economy, rebuild foreign relations, and integrate Germany into the European order were among the few bright successes of the Republic. But they were tenuous. His death left a leadership vacuum that would not be filled. What followed was drift, confusion, and a return to authoritarian solutions. As the Depression worsened, successive chancellors, Brüning, Papen, Schleicher, turned increasingly to presidential rule. Using Article 48, they bypassed Parliament and ruled by emergency decree. The Reichstag was sidelined. These men did not necessarily seek dictatorship, but they laid the path to it. In weakening democracy to save it, they made its destruction inevitable. Each crisis was met not with unity, but further polarization. The left remained divided. Social Democrats and communists hated each other more than they feared the right. The SPD tried to work within the system, even as it was dismantled around them. The KPD, following orders from Moscow, branded the SPD as social fascists and refused to cooperate. Hitler and the Nazis exploited this division, posing as the only alternative to communist revolution. And then there were the cultural battles. The 1920s in Berlin were famously wild: sexual freedom, avant-garde art, political satire, jazz, expressionism, Bauhaus architecture. It was a cultural explosion, but it was also seen by many Germans, particularly in the countryside, as evidence of decadence and decline. The Nazis effectively weaponized this perception. Their propaganda portrayed Weimar culture as corrupt, Jewish, foreign, and un-German. They linked artistic modernism with political instability. Their appeal was not just political, it was cultural, moral, and emotional. They promised not only jobs and strength, but order, tradition, and purity. In the final years of the Republic, the Nazi rise was not sudden, it was systematic. They built a mass movement, rooted in local communities, youth organizations, women's leagues, business networks, and paramilitary forces. They were not just a party, they were a parallel society. They offered belonging in a time of alienation, identity in a time of confusion. Their rallies were choreographed to stir the soul. Their uniforms, symbols, and songs gave people a sense of meaning. And at the center stood Hitler, not as a politician, but as a messianic figure. In the early 1930s, Hitler understood what his opponents did not. That emotion, not policy, would decide the future of Germany. He promised to restore national greatness, to end the shame of Versailles, to crush communism, to rebuild the economy, to revive the fatherland. He was vague on the details, intentionally so. His movement was built on myth, not policy. The Nazis also made deals. Hitler assured the military he would restore their prestige. He promised business leaders he would destroy socialism. He told nationalists he would rebuild the empire. He told Christians he would protect religious values. These promises were often contradictory, but in crisis, people do not demand consistency. They demand certainty. On January 30th, 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, it was through a backroom deal. Franz von Papen, seeking to sideline Schleicher and elevate his own influence, persuaded President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler. Papen believed he could control him. "We've hired him," he is said to have boasted. "Within 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner that he'll squeak." Instead, within 2 months, Hitler had dismantled the Republic. The story from here is well known: the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, the banning of parties, the purging of opposition. The Gleichschaltung, coordination of all institutions under Nazi control, trade unions destroyed, press muzzled, courts Nazified, education indoctrinated. The Nazis moved with speed, with purpose, and with a terrifying clarity of vision. Where the Republic had hesitated, they acted. Where democracy demanded debate, they imposed obedience. Within a year, all democratic institutions were gone. Weimar's collapse was not an accident. It was not inevitable either. It was the result of choices made by leaders, by voters, by institutions. It was the product of despair, fear, anger, and apathy. It teaches us that democracy dies not only when attacked from outside, but when it is abandoned from within. Yet for all its failure, the Weimar Republic remains one of the boldest experiments in democratic modernity. It tried to create a liberal democracy in a country without liberal traditions. It tried to govern through law after total war. It sought peace in a world that demanded punishment. It stood at the intersection of empire and republic, of 19th century conservatism and 20th century mass politics. Its rise and fall offer enduring lessons. That constitutions must be designed not only for ideal times, but for crises. That extremism feeds on economic pain and national humiliation. That civil society, the press, the unions, the judiciary, the schools, must guard democracy, not stand aloof from it. That myths, when left unchallenged, become truths. That democracy must be defended not only with laws, but with courage. In the years after 1945, as the horrors of the Third Reich came to light, Germans began to look back at Weimar not only with regret, but with a deeper understanding of what had been lost. In the West, a new republic was built with the explicit goal of avoiding the mistakes of the old. In the East, the Soviet zone dismantled Weimar's memory and replaced it with its own authoritarian model. But in West Germany, and later in a reunified Germany, Weimar became a point of reflection, a cautionary tale, and a reminder of how fragile democracy is, even in the heart of Europe. Today, as we look back on the Weimar Republic, we see not only its failure, but its warning. Democracy, even when enshrined in law, can collapse, not always with gunfire, sometimes with applause, sometimes through elections, sometimes through the very mechanisms meant to preserve it. And when it falls, the consequences can reshape history. The story of Weimar is not ancient history. It is not distant. It is not foreign. It is the story of how a modern, educated, industrial society, one with scientists, poets, artists, lawyers, and thinkers, can turn against itself. It is the story of how fear and rage can replace debate, how symbols can replace substance, how lies, repeated often enough, become foundations of action. Weimar teaches us that democracy requires more than institutions. It requires belief. It requires vigilance. And above all, it requires citizens who, even in times of fear, do not surrender their freedom in the hope of security. One of the most revealing aspects of the Weimar Republic's collapse lies in the psychology of its citizens. The slow erosion of trust, the feeling that institutions no longer responded to ordinary lives, the fear that chaos could strike at any moment. To many Germans in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Republic no longer seemed like a bulwark against disorder, but rather a source of it. What had once promised peace, prosperity, and representation had come to embody political paralysis, moral confusion, and economic despair. And so, what we see in the Weimar years is not a sudden revolution against democracy, but a gradual withdrawal from it. The people did not rise to overthrow the Republic. They simply stopped believing in it. The media of the Weimar era reflected this crisis of faith. While the Constitution guaranteed freedom of the press, the reality was a fractured and increasingly radicalized landscape. Right-wing newspapers, such as the Völkischer Beobachter, funded by the Nazis, spread anti-Semitic conspiracies and nationalist myths. Left-wing publications countered with denunciations of fascism, capitalism, and reactionary elites. The center struggled to be heard. Newspapers often served more to reinforce existing beliefs than to inform or persuade. Political literacy gave way to tribalism. Education, too, became contested ground. The Weimar curriculum attempted to instill democratic values, but the teaching core was dominated by conservatives and monarchists who distrusted the Republic. Universities became centers of right-wing agitation, where Nazi student groups grew in strength. Academic freedom existed in principle, but many professors were either ambivalent or openly hostile to the new order. The younger generation, raised amid economic crisis and national humiliation, proved highly susceptible to movements offering clarity, purpose, and redemption. The judiciary was another weak link in Weimar's democratic armor. Though technically independent, German courts reflected the values of the old imperial state. Judges frequently handed down lenient sentences to right-wing extremists, while imposing harsh penalties on leftist dissenters. This imbalance deepened public cynicism. It seemed the Republic was only partially defended. Its enemies on the right were tolerated, while those on the left were crushed. The military, the Reichswehr, was perhaps the most openly undemocratic institution in the state. Though formally under civilian control, it operated with significant autonomy. Its leadership never reconciled with the idea of democratic governance. Many generals believed in the eventual restoration of an authoritarian or monarchical regime. They saw themselves not as servants of the Republic, but as its potential saviors, waiting, watching, preparing. During the 1920s and early 30s, the army often refused to act against right-wing coup attempts while eagerly suppressing leftist uprisings. And then there was the question of memory, of how Germans processed the trauma of war and defeat. For many, the loss of 1918 was too enormous to absorb. The sudden collapse of the monarchy, the armistice, the revolution, it all happened too fast. Rather than accept defeat, many clung to the narrative that the army had been betrayed from within. The "stab in the back" myth became more than a slogan. It was a national self-delusion, one that absolved millions of responsibility and transferred blame to convenient scapegoats: Jews, socialists, liberals, intellectuals. This myth laid the emotional foundation for Nazism. Throughout the Weimar years, political violence was commonplace. Over 400 political assassinations were carried out, the vast majority by right-wing groups. The murderers of figures like Walter Rathenau and Matthias Erzberger were often treated as patriots by nationalist circles. When Rathenau, Germany's foreign minister and a prominent Jew, was gunned down in 1922, the reaction from segments of the population was not horror, but celebration. The Republic's enemies were emboldened by the fact that murder could be met with applause, or at most, a slap on the wrist. Despite all this, Weimar Germany was not without strength. The cultural and intellectual life of the Republic was extraordinary. Artists like George Gross and Otto Dix captured the contradictions and anxieties of the age with brutal honesty. Filmmakers like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau revolutionized cinema, using expressionism to probe the unconscious fears of the Republic. Writers like Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann grappled with the moral chaos of their time. In the sciences, figures like Albert Einstein, Lise Meitner, and Max Planck stood at the frontier of knowledge. But even culture became political. Modern art was attacked by conservatives as degenerate. The Nazis would later use this term to ban and burn works they deemed un-German or corrupt. The achievements of Weimar's artists, scientists, and thinkers were turned against them by those who saw democracy and modernity as twin evils. By the early 1930s, the Republic was effectively governed through presidential emergency powers. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning ruled by decree between 1930 and 1932, implementing austerity measures that worsened the Depression. His failure gave way to Franz von Papen, a reactionary Catholic nobleman who had little support in Parliament but the full backing of President Hindenburg. Papen dissolved the Reichstag and lifted the ban on the SA, the Nazi paramilitary force, hoping to use them against the left. His political miscalculation allowed Nazi street violence to explode. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis emerged as the largest party in the Reichstag with 37% of the vote. Hitler demanded the chancellorship. Hindenburg refused. In response, Hitler organized another election in November 1932, but the Nazi vote dropped to 33%. Sensing weakness, conservatives believed it was time to bring Hitler in and control him. This was the fatal mistake. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. Only 3 Nazis joined the cabinet: Hitler, Wilhelm Frick Interior, and Hermann Goering without portfolio, but head of the Prussian police. Conservatives held the rest. They believed they had outmaneuvered the Nazis. In fact, they had unleashed them. Within weeks, the Reichstag burned. Within months, the opposition was dismantled. Within a year, the Republic was gone. In August 1934, Hitler assumed the role of Führer, combining the offices of Chancellor and President. The last institutions of Weimar were swept away. The German people, through a manipulated plebiscite, confirmed this transformation. The Republic, born in revolution, had died through legality. And so, we come to the final analysis. The Weimar Republic did not collapse in a moment, but through a process. It was undone not only by extremists, but by institutions that failed to defend it, by citizens who lost faith in it, and by leaders who underestimated the danger of surrendering power in exchange for short-term stability. Its death was not inevitable, but it was foreseeable. When the post-war world emerged after 1945, the architects of the new German democracy knew what had gone wrong. The basic law of the Federal Republic of Germany, written in 1949, was shaped by the memory of Weimar's fall. The drafters created a system with stronger protections: a 5% threshold for entering Parliament to prevent fragmentation, the constructive vote of no confidence to avoid collapsing governments, a constitutional court to defend democratic principles, bans on parties that threaten democracy itself. And in 1990, when Germany was reunified after the Cold War, these lessons remained intact. The Weimar Republic had lasted 14 years. The post-war German Republic has lasted more than 75. But the lesson of Weimar remains a warning, not a relic. In any time of economic crisis, polarization, or national humiliation, the temptations of authoritarianism can re-emerge. Weimar reminds us that no democracy is immune and no republic guaranteed. It begins with fear. It escalates through division. It ends with silence. To understand the emotional terrain of the Weimar Republic's final years, we must also understand how Germans began to think about their own identity, who they were, who they had been, and who they might become again. The fall of the Kaiserreich and the humiliation of Versailles didn't just leave political ruins, it left a psychological vacuum. For centuries, Germans had looked to the monarchy, the army, the church, and the family as the cornerstones of national life. But in the 1920s, those structures were questioned, eroded, and in some cases replaced entirely. The Weimar Republic was a modern project. It was born not of continuity, but rupture. In place of inherited status, it promised merit. In place of hierarchy, it offered equality. In place of empire, it envisioned cooperation. But for many Germans, especially the conservative middle classes, this vision was not inspiring. It was threatening. For the aristocrats, the industrial barons, the rural landowners, and the traditionalists, Weimar was synonymous with instability. And for the working class, particularly in the industrial regions, it often delivered too little too late. The democratic parties, the SPD, Zentrum, DDP, faced a dilemma. If they compromised too much with the right, they alienated their own base. If they stood firm, they often lost influence or were accused of obstructionism. Over time, even voters who once supported democracy drifted toward extremes out of frustration. Each election became more polarized, each coalition more fragile. And through it all, the Nazis stood as a rising tide, claiming to be the only true opposition to chaos. The Nazi Party under Hitler was unlike any other party in Weimar. It was not structured to participate in a parliamentary system. It was structured to destroy it. The party's internal organization, centralized, militarized, and absolutely loyal to the Führer, mirrored what they intended to impose on the state. Nazi ideology was not merely nationalist. It was racial, apocalyptic, and rooted in the myth of purification. It promised not just a return to greatness, but the elimination of internal enemies. Antisemitism was not a side issue for the Nazis. It was central to their worldview. Hitler blamed Jews not only for Germany's defeat and economic woes, but for modernity itself, for liberalism, communism, capitalism, and all forms of moral decay. In Nazi propaganda, the Weimar Republic was portrayed as a Jewish invention designed to weaken the German Volk. This racialized narrative found an audience among those who had suffered during hyperinflation, joblessness, or humiliation. Jews, who made up less than 1% of the German population, became the scapegoat for a society in crisis. And yet, in the early 1920s, the Nazi Party had been on the margins. After the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, Hitler had been imprisoned and the movement temporarily banned. But prison became a platform, and Mein Kampf became the ideological blueprint for what was to come. The Nazi strategy shifted from revolution to manipulation. They would use elections, coalitions, and legality to gain entry to power, and once inside, they would end the game altogether. What made their ascent possible was not just economic depression, but elite cooperation. Without the backing of business leaders, media moguls, and conservative politicians, the Nazis would not have entered the cabinet in 1933. Men like H. Hjalmar Schacht, economist, Alfred Hugenberg, media tycoon, and Franz von Papen believed they could use Hitler. They feared the left far more than the radical right. For them, democracy had always been a temporary necessity, not a principle. And yet, even as Hitler entered the government legally, the signs of what was coming were clear. The Nazi Party had made no secret of its plans. Their Sturmabteilung terrorized political opponents. Their rhetoric openly threatened Jews, Marxists, and traitors. Their newspapers called for purges and national rebirth through struggle. But still, many Germans hoped that once in power, Hitler would moderate, that he would grow responsible, that the machinery of state would contain him. It did not. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the excuse for a crackdown. The enabling act gave Hitler dictatorial powers. One by one, the institutions of Weimar fell: courts, unions, the press, federal states, political parties. The Gleichschaltung process unified all aspects of public life under Nazi control. What was once a complex, pluralist society became a monolith, where loyalty was demanded and dissent destroyed. Those who resisted, communists, social democrats, union leaders, some clergy, were imprisoned, exiled, or murdered. The concentration camps that would later become sites of genocide were first built to hold these political enemies. The early months of Nazi rule were not yet defined by world war or extermination, but by the annihilation of democracy. And in this final death of Weimar, we find the ultimate irony. The Nazis did not storm the gates, they walked through them. They used the mechanisms of the Republic to bury the Republic. They passed laws, held votes, published decrees. They wore suits, not just uniforms. And the civil servants, judges, generals, and bureaucrats, many of whom had once sworn loyalty to the Republic, switched allegiance almost overnight. The apparatus of the state did not resist. It adapted. Why didn't more people fight back? Some did. But most, overwhelmed by economic insecurity, fear of civil war, or hope for order, either accepted the new regime or looked the other way. Some even welcomed it, grateful that something was finally being done. The collapse of Weimar was not only political, it was psychological. The Republic had failed to win the hearts of enough of its people. And when the alternative came wrapped in promises of strength, unity, and renewal, many embraced it. In the years that followed, the consequences became clear. The Nazi regime led Germany into a catastrophic war, committed industrialized genocide, and left the country in ruins. Tens of millions would die, cities would burn, borders would shift, lives would be shattered. The German people would face judgment not only for the crimes committed in their name, but for the democracy they had allowed to perish. But out of this destruction, a new Germany was eventually born. In the West, a federal republic was constructed on the ashes of two failed states, Imperial and Weimar. Its architects studied the Weimar collapse carefully. They built in safeguards, checks, and balances. They taught democratic values in schools. They outlawed Nazi symbols and parties. They made remembrance a civic duty. Weimar thus lives on, not as a model, but as a lesson. It shows how quickly freedom can be lost, how legal systems can be twisted, how fear can outweigh reason, and how democratic failure does not always come with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet, rationalized steps. The story of the Weimar Republic is not simply German history. It is a mirror held up to every democracy that takes its own survival for granted. As the Weimar Republic passed into history, buried beneath the momentum of dictatorship, war, and genocide, its memory would remain contested. For decades after 1945, Germans struggled with how to remember this republic that had briefly stood between two authoritarian nightmares, the Kaiserreich and the Third Reich. In West Germany, Weimar was at first remembered largely for its failures: inflation, instability, chaos, and surrender. In East Germany, it was dismissed as a bourgeois facade, a capitalist democracy that failed to serve the working class. Only later, after reunification, would a more complex, nuanced understanding of Weimar emerge. And that understanding matters, not just to historians, but to any society attempting to balance liberty with stability, rights with responsibility, and order with openness. The Weimar Republic had tried to do all of those things. It had been the most ambitious democratic experiment in German history up to that point, and its collapse became one of the defining warnings of the 20th century. To explore that final collapse even more closely, it is worth looking again at the political pathway that led from fragile democracy to authoritarian control, not through coups or invasions, but through legal mechanisms and constitutional breakdowns. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933, was not just another emergency measure. It was the constitutional tool that transferred legislative power from the Reichstag to Hitler's cabinet. The act needed a two-thirds majority to pass because it amended the Weimar Constitution. And to get it, the Nazis combined propaganda, intimidation, and deals. The communists, whose parliamentary representation might have blocked it, had already been arrested or forced underground after the Reichstag fire. The Social Democrats courageously voted against it, but they stood alone. The Centre Party, led by Ludwig Kahrs, a Catholic priest, was pressured into voting in favor after receiving vague promises from Hitler to respect the church. Conservatives, nationalists, and even liberals rationalized their support, convinced the act was temporary or necessary to bring stability. But the Enabling Act was irreversible. Once it passed, Hitler no longer needed the Reichstag. Democracy was effectively dead, even if the corpse twitched a while longer. One by one, the Nazi regime neutralized or absorbed every institution that could threaten its control. Trade unions were disbanded on May 2, 1933, replaced by the German Labour Front under Nazi leadership. All political parties were banned, except for the NSDAP. The Länder, or regional state governments, were dissolved and replaced by Reich governors loyal to Berlin. The judiciary was brought into line under the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, the idea that law must serve the racial and ideological unity of the people, not abstract legal principles. What was most chilling, perhaps, was how easily it all happened. The institutions of the Weimar Republic did not mount a meaningful resistance. Many welcomed the clarity, the order, the restoration of traditional hierarchies. Others feared for their safety or careers. Some believed they were serving Germany, even if it meant bending the law. Many believed Hitler would be a transitional figure, an extremist who could be controlled once the crisis passed. But there was no going back. Hitler was not simply a populist. He was an ideologue with an unshakable vision of racial war, national rebirth through conquest, and purification of the German body politic. He did not see power as a means to govern. He saw it as a means to transform. This transformation began immediately. Cultural organizations were coordinated, gleichgeschaltet. Universities were purged of Jewish and left-wing professors. Book burnings began in May 1933, symbolizing the regime's rejection of Weimar-era modernism, liberalism, and internationalism. Among the authors banned were Freud, Einstein, Marx, Mann, and Brecht. The Republic's intellectual legacy was declared an enemy of the new Germany. Even before war or genocide began, the regime moved swiftly against its internal enemies. Concentration camps like Dachau were established as early as 1933, not for Jews alone, but for political opponents, journalists, socialists, and anyone deemed asocial. The Tsar, which had helped bring the Nazis to power through street violence, was itself purged in 1934 during the Night of the Long Knives, an internal cleansing that reassured the army and eliminated rivals. And as Hitler cemented power, the Weimar Constitution, still technically in force, became a hollow shell. Its words remained, but its meaning had been gutted. No more elections, no more parliamentary debate, only orders, propaganda, spectacle, and fear. This is the legacy of Weimar's fall, that tyranny can arise not in spite of constitutions, but through them, that the legal mechanisms of democracy can be used to erase democracy, that a republic can be extinguished not only by revolution, but by its own laws, exploited by those who reject its very spirit. Yet Weimar was not just failure, it was also courage. The Social Democrats who opposed the Enabling Act knew they were signing their political death warrants. Otto Well's final speech before the vote was a stirring defense of democratic principle. You can take our lives and our freedom, but you cannot take our honor. His words were soon banned, his party outlawed, his members arrested, but the moral line had been drawn. There were others, judges, teachers, pastors, journalists, who resisted in small, often doomed ways. Their resistance would be forgotten for years, but it formed a thread of dignity running through a dark time. And after the fall of Hitler, that thread would help Germans rebuild. In 1949, when the new Federal Republic of Germany was founded, its leaders consciously avoided repeating Weimar's mistakes. The new Basic Law included clauses to prevent the rise of parties that sought to destroy democracy. Article 1 proclaimed the inviolable dignity of human beings. Article 20 enshrined the democratic, social, and federal character of the Republic. The powers of emergency decrees were restricted. The president's role was made largely ceremonial. Political education was funded. The Nazi past was studied, not hidden. The republic that emerged, first in the West, later unified with the East, would become one of the world's most stable democracies. Its success is due in large part to the memory of Weimar. In schools, students learn about the collapse not just as history, but as a civic warning. Museums preserve the documents of its birth and death. Memorials remember its martyrs. And though the ghosts of nationalism and extremism still linger, as they do in every society, Germany remains vigilant, scarred by its past, but shaped by it as well. In the broader world, the Weimar Republic continues to be studied as a case of democratic fragility, a reminder that democratic institutions must be defended, renewed, and inhabited with spirit as well as form, that elections are not enough, that constitutional clauses are only as strong as the people who enforce them, that freedom can be lost more easily than it is won. For modern audiences, Weimar remains eerily relevant. It shows how economic crisis can destabilize politics, how cultural backlash can erode tolerance, how media fragmentation can polarize discourse, how misinformation and myth can override fact, how elite miscalculations can empower radicals, and how fear can turn citizens against democracy itself. It reminds us that the test of democracy does not come in calm times, but in storm. It is in the storm that the boundaries are tested, the institutions strained, the beliefs challenged. And it is in the storm that democracies either adapt or collapse. The Weimar Republic collapsed, but from its ashes, new republics have risen, not only in Germany, but around the world. And each of them carries with it the lesson written in Weimar's short, turbulent life, that democracy is never inherited. It is chosen, again and again. As we approach the end of the Weimar Republic's tragic and cautionary tale, it is important to return to the beginning, not simply to recount the events, but to examine the forces that shaped them. The Weimar Republic was born out of a world war that shattered empires and redefined the very nature of modern power. Germany's sudden transformation from a militaristic monarchy into a democratic republic was not accompanied by a revolution in values, elites, or institutions. That disconnect would haunt every year of its fragile existence. The republic was declared, not built. It had no founding consensus, no popular uprising that rallied the country behind a new order. It was instead a solution to chaos. Friedrich Ebert and the SPD sought to avoid a Bolshevik revolution by accepting the mantle of power quickly, striking deals with the military and conservative establishment in the process. But in doing so, they alienated large parts of the left, especially the Spartacists, who believed the Republic was a betrayal of true socialism. This compromise, meant to secure the Republic, left it permanently vulnerable. It inherited enemies on both flanks, reactionaries who longed for monarchy and social revolutionaries who saw it as a capitalist illusion. Each of these factions had their own vision of Germany, and neither believed in the legitimacy of the parliamentary republic. This foundational rift was never healed. What followed were years of extraordinary instability: assassinations, paramilitary uprisings, attempted coups, hyperinflation, occupation, humiliation. Every time the republic seemed to find its footing, a new shock knocked it off balance. But perhaps its greatest challenge was emotional. Weimar Germany was a country in mourning. Mourning the loss of its empire, of its soldiers, of its place in the world. Mourning a past that could never return and a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Mourning personal losses, family members lost in the war, livelihoods ruined by economic collapse. In such an atmosphere, democracy struggled to inspire. It appeared, too often, as a system of compromise in a time that demanded certainty, as a mechanism of weakness, not strength, as a series of fragile coalitions, unable to act decisively. Its defenders often appeared technocratic, cautious, legalistic, while its enemies offered grand visions, emotional clarity, and bold solutions, however dangerous. Weimar Germany was a deeply divided society, not just politically, but culturally, socially, and geographically. The urban-rural divide was enormous. Berlin, with its nightlife, secularism, and progressive politics, seemed like another planet to citizens in the Catholic South or conservative East. Class divisions remained sharp, and ethnic minorities, especially Jews, were both participants in and victims of the Republic's transformation. Antisemitism, while not invented by the Nazis, found fertile ground in Weimar. Jews were prominent in many of the Republic's achievements: science, literature, law, journalism. But this visibility was often turned against them. Nazi propaganda depicted Jews as the architects of Weimar's degeneracy, blaming them for Germany's defeat, for modern art, for capitalism and communism alike. These conspiracies, amplified in times of crisis, helped prepare the ground for the racial ideology that would later fuel the Holocaust. But these were not just the delusions of thugs. They were spoken in Parliament. They were printed in newspapers. They were whispered in courtrooms and universities. The failure of Weimar was also a failure of elites, those who knew better but said nothing, those who compromised with hate, believing they could control it. Many hoped Hitler would be a useful strongman, a transitional figure, a man who could defeat communism and restore order. But within months, he had outmaneuvered them all. The Republic's final moments were not dramatic because the collapse had already happened. By the time Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor, the institutions were hollowed out. The laws remained, but the belief was gone. And when belief dies, democracy cannot survive. Even now, with nearly a century of hindsight, Weimar remains difficult to fully comprehend. Its contradictions were profound. It was at once the most progressive society in Europe and the most fragile. It gave the world some of its most enduring artistic and scientific achievements, even as it harbored some of its most violent ideologies. It offered hope after horror, then fell into something far worse. What, then, does Weimar teach us? It teaches us that democracy is not simply a structure of government. It is a culture, a set of habits, a willingness to engage across difference, and a shared commitment to rules even when outcomes are disappointing. It teaches us that polarization, when allowed to deepen unchecked, hollows out the center and empowers the extremes. It teaches us that economic despair, if left unaddressed, becomes political dynamite. It teaches us that institutions, no matter how well designed, cannot survive without public trust. It teaches us that hate, once legitimized, becomes law. And it teaches us that democracy is not lost in one moment. It is eroded piece by piece, through fear, through apathy, through rationalization, through silence. For today's world, these are not abstract lessons. Democracies across the globe still face many of the same pressures Weimar did. Economic inequality, cultural backlash, political fragmentation, the rise of extremism, media manipulation, and erosion of truth. In each case, the test is not whether the Constitution holds, but whether the people believe it is worth defending. The Weimar Republic collapsed, but in its short life, it showed what was possible and what was at stake. It was a mirror to the human condition, our hopes, our fears, our capacity for progress, and our vulnerability to destruction. It was a republic made by people, and unmade by them too. And in remembering Weimar, we remember that the fate of democracy never lies in documents alone. It lies in us.